I took the job because it was easy money, or at least that's what I thought. The contractor didn't ask too many questions, just wanted someone to stay in an old hunting cabin for a few nights while his team finished up work on the roof. He needed someone to keep an eye on the tools and materials, nothing too heavy, just making sure nothing got stolen. The pay was decent and I didn't have anything better to do. It was early November, and the Yorkshire Dales were already sinking into winter. The days were short, the air sharp, and the kind of damp that settled in your bones. The cabin sat in the middle of a valley, surrounded by rolling hills covered in dying bracken and half-bare trees. It wasn't a bad place to be, but the isolation hit me the moment I stepped out of my van. The road leading up to the cabin was barely a road at all, just two muddy tracks cutting through the grass. My van struggled the last few meters, tires slipping, and I knew I wasn't getting out of there in a hurry if the weather turned worse. That thought sat in the back of my mind as I grabbed my bag and made my way inside. The cabin was small, basic, and cold. One main room with a fireplace, a cot shoved against the wall, a tiny kitchen area, and a locked storage room where the tools were kept. The only light came from a single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Electricity came from a generator out back, though the guy who hired me warned me to use it sparingly. Fuel was running low. There was a radio on the shelf, but no signal. No Wi-Fi, no phone service. The nearest village was a good 15 miles away, and the last few miles of road were barely passable. I was on my own. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire, ate a sandwich, and sat there listening to the wind pushing against the cabin. Every so often, I'd hear something scuttle across the roof, branches, maybe, or a bird. At some point, I must have dozed off. When I woke up, the fire had burned low, and the room was filled with shadows. I heard something outside. Not the wind, not an animal, something slow, deliberate. Footsteps. I held my breath, listening. They circled the cabin once, then stopped just outside the door. I waited, heart hammering in my chest. Nothing. After a few minutes, I forced myself up, grabbed the flashlight, and edged toward the window. I couldn't see much, just the outline of the trees against the night sky, the grass swaying in the wind. No sign of anyone. I told myself it was my imagination. Maybe a deer had wandered too close. Maybe I was just jumpy, not used to being alone out here. Either way, I shoved the chair against the door before going back to sleep. The second day passed without trouble. I checked the supplies, made sure nothing had been stolen, and spent most of the afternoon chopping wood for the fire. The sky was gray, the air thick with the promise of rain. As night fell, the wind picked up again, howling through the valley. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the fire, the rhythm of chopping wood, the weight of the axe in my hands. But as the hours dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Started small, a flicker of movement in the trees, a sound just beyond the edge of the clearing. I told myself it was nothing, but then, just past midnight, I heard something again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving toward the cabin. I turned off the light and waited. The footsteps stopped just outside the window, and for a long time, there was silence. Then, a slow, quiet tap against the glass. I barely breathed. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever was outside would hear it. Tap, tap, tap. I forced myself to move, reaching for the axe I'd left near the fireplace. My fingers closed around the handle, the wood warm from the heat of the fire. Silence. I waited. Nothing. After what felt like hours, I finally worked up the nerve to check the window. No one was there, but just beneath the glass, pressed into the damp soil, was a single boot print. By morning, I was ready to leave. I didn't care about the money, I just wanted out. But when I stepped outside, I found the van wasn't going anywhere. The back tires were completely buried in mud. The ground turned to mush from last night's rain. I tried rocking it back and forth, shoving branches under the wheels, but it was useless. I wasn't getting out of there anytime soon. That left one option: wait it out. I spent most of the day checking the area, looking for any sign of who might have been out there last night. There were no fresh tracks, nothing stolen, no signs of forced entry. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened again. the wind carrying the first bite of an approaching storm. I made sure the door was locked, barricaded the window with the heaviest thing I could find, and kept the axe within arm's reach. The storm hit just past midnight. The wind roared through the valley, rain hammering against the roof. I sat by the fire, trying to convince myself that nothing was out there. Then I heard it. Not the wind, not the rain. Something outside. Footsteps, slow and heavy, circling the cabin. I gripped the axe tighter, my knuckles white. The footsteps stopped. Then the doorknob rattled. I held my breath. Then a long, slow scratch against the wood. Whoever was out there wasn't in a hurry. They were waiting, listening. I forced myself to move, stepping quietly toward the window. The rain made it hard to see, but for a split second, I caught movement, just the shape of a figure standing near the treeline. Watching, waiting, then they were gone. I didn't sleep. By the time morning came, I had made up my mind. I was walking out of there. The rain had stopped, but the valley was soaked, the mud thick and heavy. I grabbed my bag, the axe, and whatever supplies I could carry. As I stepped outside, I stopped. Near the treeline, half buried in the mud, was something that hadn't been there before. A single, rusted hunting knife. The blade was dull, the handle wrapped in old, rotting leather. I didn't touch it. I didn't look back. I just started walking. Took me 6 hours to reach the village. 6 hours of mud, freezing rain, and the constant feeling that I was being watched. When I finally made it, I went straight to the pub, ordered a drink, and asked if anyone knew about the cabin in the valley. The bartender just gave me a long look before shaking his head. "Shouldn't have stayed there," he muttered. "Not after what happened last time." I didn't ask what he meant. I just finished my drink, got in my van, and left, and I never went back. It started with an old hunting cabin deep in the woods, the kind that looks like it had been there long before anyone alive could remember. It was isolated, miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by thick trees that seemed to stretch on forever. I wasn't new to this area. I had hunted these woods with my dad when I was a kid, but I had never stayed out here overnight. This trip was supposed to be different. I wanted a break from life, from the noise of the city, from work, from everything. Just me, my rifle, and the quiet. The cabin wasn't mine. It belonged to a family friend, a guy named Bill who had owned it for years but rarely used it. When I told him I needed a place to get away for a bit, he tossed me the keys and said, "Use it as long as you want, just don't forget to lock up." That was it. No warnings, no odd looks, just a favor from one man to another. I drove out there in the late afternoon, my truck rattling over the uneven dirt road leading into the woods. The deeper I went, the quieter everything got. The sky had started turning gray by the time I reached the clearing where the cabin stood. It was a small, one-room structure made of dark wood, with a sagging porch and a metal roof that had rust spots bleeding through the paint. It looked sturdy enough, but it had that abandoned feel, like no one had set foot in it for a long time. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was stale, carrying that mix of dust and old wood. There was a cot in one corner, a small stove against the back wall, and a wooden table with a single chair. The windows had old, yellowed curtains that barely let in any light. It was simple, just what I needed. I set my gear down, made sure my rifle was loaded, and went outside to check the surroundings before nightfall. The woods were dense, the trees packed so closely together that it was hard to see more than 20 feet in some places. The air was heavy, still, as if even the wind didn't want to pass through. The only sounds were my own footsteps crunching over the fallen leaves. I built a small fire outside the cabin and cooked a quick meal. As the sun sank, the temperature dropped fast. It wasn't freezing, but it was cold enough to make me grateful for the thick jacket I had brought. I stared into the fire, letting my mind wander, enjoying the quiet. Then I heard it. It was distant at first, barely noticeable. A rustling sound, like something moving through the trees. I figured it was an animal, a deer, maybe a coyote, but the sound didn't fade. Kept coming, growing louder, closer. I stood up, rifle in hand, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. The woods were thick, but something about the movement felt off. It wasn't the normal, scattered steps of an animal. It was slow, deliberate. I could hear the branches snapping under its weight. Whatever it was big. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. It felt heavy, pressing down on me like something was watching, waiting. My eyes scanned the tree-line, but I couldn't see anything beyond the glow of the fire. I stayed like that for a long time, listening, waiting. Nothing happened. The sound didn't come back. After a while, I convinced myself it had been a bear or maybe an elk passing through. I put out the fire, went inside, and locked the door. The cabin felt smaller at night. The single lantern I had brought barely lit the space. I lay on the cot, rifle within reach, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to a sound outside. It was soft at first, almost too faint to notice. A shuffling noise, like footsteps moving just beyond the cabin walls. My body went stiff. I held my breath, listening. Then came the scratching. Slow, deliberate, the sound of something dragging its nails or claws along the wooden walls of the cabin. It moved from one side to the next, circling me, never stopping. I gripped my rifle, heart pounding. It had to be an animal, a raccoon, maybe a bobcat. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. No animal moved like that. No animal circled a cabin like it was looking for a way in. Then I heard the breathing. It was right outside the door. Low, steady, too deep to be human. I forced myself to sit up, moving as quietly as possible. My hands were sweaty around the rifle. Pointed it at the door, waiting. The breathing stopped. Silence. Then the doorknob rattled. A slow, careful turn. The lock held. I didn't move. My heart was hammering in my chest so hard I thought it might give me away. Then came the voice. It was my own. I don't know how else to explain it, but it was my voice, speaking from the other side of the door. Let me in. Flat, emotionless. It didn't sound right. It sounded like someone trying to mimic me, but getting the tone just a little bit wrong. I didn't respond. The doorknob twisted harder. Then the voice changed. It became someone else. Someone I didn't know. Please, it said. I'm lost. It sounded more human now, but not enough. The way it spoke was off, the words too slow, too careful. I raised the rifle, aiming directly at the door. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human. Then the footsteps started again. Slow, dragging, moving around the cabin. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, as soon as the sun was up, I packed my gear, threw open the door, and scanned the area. Nothing was there. No footprints, no signs of anything having been outside. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. Carved into the wooden door, in deep, uneven scratches, were 3 words. Let me in. I never went back to that cabin. I never told Bill what happened. But I know what I heard. And I know that whatever was out there wasn't human. I never liked working night shifts, but at that point in my life, I didn't have much of a choice. I was 34 years old, working maintenance for a company that managed old properties across the countryside. Most of the time, it was simple things, checking up on abandoned buildings, making sure squatters hadn't moved in, and occasionally fixing up remote places that the company planned to sell. That's how I ended up at the graveyard cabin. It wasn't a place anyone lived in. It was an old caretaker's shack, built right on the edge of a forgotten cemetery deep in the woods. The company owned the land, but it hadn't been touched in years. The cabin was supposed to be checked on every 6 months, but no one had been out there in over 2 years. I was given the job. I drove out in an old truck, following miles of dirt roads until I found the turnoff. The path leading to the cabin was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and thick brush. I had to get out and move fallen branches just to make it through. The deeper I went, the more I realized how isolated the place was. The trees closed in, dark and heavy, the sky barely visible through the thick branches. It had rained earlier in the day, and the air was damp, carrying the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves. When I finally reached the cabin, it was worse than I expected. The wood was rotting, the windows were filthy, and the front door was slightly open, hanging crooked on its hinges. The cemetery sat just beyond it, a field of weathered headstones stretching into the trees. Some were leaning, others had fallen completely, and the ground was covered in dead grass and creeping vines. I killed the engine and sat in the truck for a minute, listening. No wind, no birds, just the distant sound of water dripping from the trees. Something about the place made me uneasy, but I had a job to do. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out. The first thing I did was check the outside of the cabin. The back door was locked, but the front was open, just as I had seen. That wasn't normal. No one was supposed to be out here. I looked for footprints, but the rain had washed everything clean. The place had a sagging front porch, half of the railing missing, and a single wooden step that creaked under my weight. Inside, it was worse than I thought. The air was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and old wood. The cabin was just one big room. An old bed in the corner, a rusted stove, and a small table covered in dust. There were no signs of recent activity. No footprints in the dust, no trash, no personal belongings. Just a place that had been left to rot. I checked the stove, the walls, even the bed. Everything was in the same condition it had been the last time someone had come out here. I took out my phone to check the time, almost 8 p.m. I finish up quickly and be on my way. Then I heard something outside. It was faint, but clear. A rustling sound near the tree line. I turned off my flashlight and stood still, listening. The woods were thick, tangled, the cemetery barely visible beyond the trees. I scanned the area, but I didn't see anything. Probably an animal. A deer, maybe. I went back inside and made some notes. The place was falling apart, but it was still standing. No signs of break-ins, no squatters, no major damage besides natural decay. I could report it and be done. Then I saw it. Near the cemetery, barely visible in the fading light, something was moving between the headstones. A dark shape, low to the ground, shifting slowly. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't anything I could recognize. I stayed still, gripping my flashlight. The thing moved, slipping behind a row of headstones. I waited, heart pounding, but it didn't reappear. I didn't want to investigate, but I knew I wouldn't be able to leave without checking. I stepped off the porch, moving slow. The ground was soft from the rain, my boots sinking slightly into the mud. The cemetery was silent, the headstones barely readable, worn down by time. I reached the spot where I had seen the movement. Nothing. The ground was undisturbed. No footprints, no broken branches, just wet earth and stone. Then I heard it again. Behind me, I turned, flashlight sweeping over the trees. A shape darted out of view, something quick and low to the ground. My breath caught in my throat. It was fast, too fast for anything that should be out here. I took a step back, then another. I didn't care what it was anymore. I was leaving. I hurried toward the truck, but before I reached it, I saw something else. The cabin door. It was closed. I hadn't shut it. I stood there, gripping my flashlight, trying to think. I had left it open when I stepped outside. There was no wind, no reason it should have moved. Something was inside. I reached into my jacket for the small knife I carried. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I took a slow step forward, then another. My boots scraped against the wood of the porch. Then, from inside the cabin, a sound. A single, soft creak of the floorboards. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The sound didn't come again. I took a step back. I wasn't going inside. Whatever was in there, it could stay. I turned and walked to the truck, keeping my eyes on the cabin the whole time. My hands were shaking as I reached for the door handle. I climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The headlights flooded the front of the cabin. Nothing moved. I backed up, turning onto the overgrown path. The headlights swept across the cemetery one last time, illuminating the old stones, the twisted trees, the wet ground, and something else. Standing at the edge of the tree line, just beyond the graves, a figure, tall, motionless, facing me. I didn't stop. I didn't breathe. I pressed the gas and drove. I didn't look back. By the time I made it to the main road, my hands were so tight on the wheel that my knuckles ached. I drove straight to the office, filled out the report, and turned in my keys. I quit the next day. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't want to know, but I do know one thing. I wasn't alone in that graveyard, and I never will be. The night had settled heavy over the forest by the time I reached the cabin. The rain had started an hour ago, turning the dirt road into a mess of thick mud. My truck struggled with the terrain, tires slipping, but I eventually made it up the narrow path. It wasn't my cabin, just a place a friend of mine had let me use for the weekend. I needed time away from everything, a break from the stress of work and the constant noise of the city. The thought of spending a few days alone in the woods had seemed like a good idea when I planned it. Now, standing outside in the rain, fumbling with the keys, I wasn't so sure. The cabin wasn't much. Just a single-story wooden structure with a small porch, a tin roof, and a chimney that hadn't seen smoke in a while. The air smelled like wet wood, damp leaves, and something else. Something stale, like old air that hadn't been moved in a long time. Inside, the cabin was colder than I expected. The wood stove sat in the corner, a small pile of logs stacked beside it. I dropped my bag near the door and went straight for the matches. The sooner I got a fire going, the better. I wasn't about to spend the night shivering. As the fire took, the cabin lit up in a flickering orange glow, shadows stretching along the walls. The place had one bedroom, a kitchen area, and a small bathroom with a sink and toilet. Basic, but enough. The furniture was old but solid. A wooden table with 2 chairs, a couch against the far wall, and a rocking chair near the window. A thick layer of dust covered everything, which meant my friend hadn't been up here in a while. I sat down on the couch, listening to the rain hammering the roof. The wind had picked up, and the trees outside creaked in protest. I should have felt relaxed. The whole reason I came here was to unwind, but something about the place didn't sit right. Maybe it was just the isolation. Maybe it was the way the trees pressed in too close, or the way the firelight made everything feel smaller. An hour passed. The rain kept falling. I ate a quick meal, just some canned soup I'd heated over the stove, then decided to check the place out a little more. There wasn't much to see, but I wanted to make sure all the doors and windows were locked before I settled in for the night. I started with the front door, testing the lock. It held firm. The windows were next. The one by the rocking chair was fine, as was the one in the kitchen. Then I got to the bedroom window. It was already locked, but something about it made me pause. The glass had smudges on it, like someone had touched it recently. I ran a finger over them. Not dust, something oily, something fresh. I tried to tell myself it was just condensation, that maybe the rain had done something weird to the glass. But then I looked down. There were footprints outside. Not old ones, not ones half washed away by the rain. These were clear, deep impressions in the wet mud, leading from the tree lean to the window, and then away again. I stared at them for a long time. The fire crackled behind me, but the warmth didn't reach my skin anymore. I felt exposed, standing there, like I had my back turned to something I shouldn't. Slowly, I stepped away from the window, my heartbeat picking up. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and turned it on. Through the rain-streaked glass, I scanned the woods. The beam bounced off tree trunks, cutting through the dark in thin, shaky lines. Nothing moved, nothing changed, but that didn't mean no one was out there. I stood there for a while, watching. Then, finally, I let the curtain fall back into place. I didn't like this. I didn't like any of it. I checked the back door, locked. Checked the small shed out back through the window, untouched. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just some hunter or hiker passing through earlier. Maybe they got too close. Maybe they were just curious. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I forced myself to sit back down, keeping the flashlight within reach. The rain had softened a little, turning into a steady drizzle. The wind had died down too. For a while, nothing happened. I almost convinced myself that I'd overreacted. And then I heard it. A sound from outside. Not the wind, not the rain. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the back of the cabin. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My ears strained, trying to pick up every detail. The steps stopped near the back door. A pause. Then, a soft scrape, someone testing the handle. I grabbed the poker from beside the wood stove. The handle rattled again, harder this time. Locked. Thank God. For a long time, there was silence. Then the footsteps moved again, circling around toward the side of the cabin. I tightened my grip on the poker. The fire had burned down a little, leaving the cabin darker than before. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. The steps reached the front porch. The wood creaked under the weight of whoever was out there. Then, another pause. Another long, unbearable silence. I forced myself to move, standing up as quietly as I could. My truck keys were in my bag, just a few feet away. If I had to, I could make a run for it. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps retreated. Back down the steps, back into the trees. I didn't move for a long time. I just stood there, gripping the poker, listening to the rain. The rest of the night stretched on, endless and heavy. I didn't sleep. I barely blinked. Every small sound made my muscles tighten, my breath hitch. The fire died down completely, leaving the cabin cold and dark. By the time the first light of morning broke through the trees, I was already packing my bag. I didn't even bother making coffee. I just grabbed my things, threw on my jacket, and stepped outside. The footprints were still there. New ones. They led from the porch back into the woods, disappearing into the trees. I didn't look any longer than I had to. I got in my truck, started the engine, and didn't stop driving until I was miles away from that cabin. I never went back, never asked my friend about it, never told anyone what happened. But I know what I heard, and I know someone was out there, waiting, watching, and they weren't just passing through. It was the kind of cold that made your bones ache. A wet, miserable cold. The kind that crept through your clothes no matter how many layers you had on. The kind that got under your skin and settled deep inside, making you feel like you'd never be warm again. I was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick forest, miles away from the nearest paved road. The cabin was old. Not the charming, rustic kind of old, but the forgotten, falling apart kind. The kind where the walls were warped from years of neglect, the wood swollen from the constant damp, and the floor creaked no matter how careful you were. It had been my uncle's, though I hadn't seen him in years. He'd disappeared, just vanished one day, leaving behind nothing but this place and a whole lot of unanswered questions. I wasn't sentimental. I didn't come here to dig up old memories or try to figure out what had happened to him. I came here because I needed a break from everything. The noise of the city, the weight of responsibilities, the constant feeling of being watched even when I was alone. I wanted quiet. I wanted space. The drive had taken longer than I expected, the road narrowing into a muddy path that barely qualified as a trail. My truck had struggled through deep ruts, the tires spinning in the wet earth more than once. By the time I reached the cabin, the sky was already darkening, heavy clouds pressing down, thick with the promise of rain. I stepped out of the truck, stretching my stiff legs, and took in the cabin. It looked smaller than I remembered. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were so dirty they were almost opaque. The front door hung slightly open, shifting with the wind. That made me stop. I was sure I had locked it. I had stopped by a few months back, after the lawyer handling my uncle's affairs gave me the key. I hadn't gone inside then, just checked the locks, made sure no one had broken in. I remembered pushing the door shut, testing the lock. It had been stiff, but it had held. Now it was open. I stood there for a moment, listening. The wind rustled through the trees, branches creaking, leaves whispering against each other. Rain started to fall, slow at first, soft patters on the leaves, then heavier, cold droplets striking my skin. I stepped onto the porch. The boards groaned under my weight. I pushed the door open wider. The inside was worse than I remembered. Dust coated every surface, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and something else. Something stale, almost metallic. The furniture was still there, though it was covered in grime, the cushions on the old couch sunken, the fabric torn. The fireplace was empty except for a few charred logs and a scattering of ash. I dropped my bag by the door, brushing rain from my jacket. I had planned on cleaning up a bit, maybe getting a fire going, but now all I could think about was the door. Had someone been here? Was someone still here? I checked the back door. It was locked. The windows were all shut, the latches stiff from years of disuse. If someone had been inside, they hadn't gotten in through the back. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I had just forgotten to lock it. Maybe the wind had pushed it open, but it didn't feel right. I went back outside to grab more of my gear. The rain was steady now, drumming against the roof, soaking into the ground. I grabbed my sleeping bag, a lantern, and some firewood from the truck, then locked the door behind me. I spent the next hour getting the place as livable as possible. The fireplace took some work, but eventually I got a fire going. The flickering light cast long shadows across the walls, making the cabin feel smaller, more enclosed. I tried to ignore the feeling in my gut, the itch at the back of my mind that told me something was off. I checked my phone. No service. That didn't surprise me. I had expected it. Still, it made the feeling worse. I ate a quick meal, then unrolled my sleeping bag near the fire. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. The rain came in sheets now, heavy and relentless, drowning out all other sounds. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind and rain, waiting for sleep to come. Then I heard it, a noise from outside, a thud. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a branch breaking under the weight of the rain. It was deliberate, heavy. I held my breath. Another thud, closer this time. I sat up slowly, every muscle tense. The fire flickered, casting strange shadows along the walls. I reached for the lantern, turning the knob as low as it would go. The light dimmed, leaving the room in near darkness. Another thud, right outside the door. I forced myself to breathe slowly, evenly. I reached for the knife I had packed. It wasn't much, but it was something. Silence. Then the door creaked. The handle turned. It stopped. Then the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. I stayed still. The footsteps stopped near the window. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, slowly, something pressed against the glass. A shadow, a shape. I could barely make it out in the darkness, but it was there. A figure, standing just outside, watching. The rain poured. The fire crackled. The figure didn't move. Minutes passed. An eternity. Then, just as slowly as it had appeared, it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, listening, waiting, knife in hand. The footsteps didn't return. When morning came, I went outside. The rain had washed away most of the footprints, but I could still see them near the porch. Deep impressions in the mud, circling the cabin. I left that day. I didn't pack up properly. I didn't care. I got in my truck and drove, pushing through the mud, through the narrow road, back to civilization. I never went back. The cabin is still there, still abandoned, and somewhere out in those woods, so is whoever or whatever was watching me that night. It had been raining for hours, the kind of rain that doesn't let up, that soaks into the ground and fills the air with the smell of wet soil and pine. The kind that makes everything feel colder than it is. The roads had turned into slick, twisting ribbons of mud and stone, and the wind howled through the valleys like something alive. I had been driving through the mountains of northern Italy for most of the afternoon, trying to make it to a cabin a friend had lent me for a few days. A quiet place, tucked away in the trees, far from anything. It seemed perfect when he offered it to me. A break from the stress of life, a place to clear my head. But now, with the rain hammering down and the sky growing dark, it didn't feel as inviting. I almost missed the turnoff. A narrow, barely visible path veered off the road. A single wooden sign barely visible in the rain. I slowed down, the tires slipping slightly as I turned onto the muddy track. The headlights cut through the rain, but the trees pressed in on both sides, making it feel like I was driving into a tunnel. The further I went, the rougher the path became. Rocks jutted out of the mud, and deep puddles splashed against the underside of the car. My hands tightened on the wheel as I carefully navigated each twist and dip. After what felt like forever, the cabin came into view. A small, weathered structure made of dark wood, crouched between the trees like it had been there forever. The roof sloped low, with a stone chimney rising at one end. The porch was simple, a few steps leading up to a wooden door, flanked by 2 shuttered windows. The whole place looked old but sturdy. More importantly, it looked dry. I parked as close as I could, grabbed my bag, and made a run for it. By the time I reached the door, my clothes were soaked, the cold sinking into my skin. The key turned easily in the lock, and I pushed inside, kicking the door shut behind me. The cabin smelled of wood and dust, with a faint trace of smoke lingering in the air. The main room was simple: an old couch, a wooden table, a stone fireplace against one wall. A single hallway led off to what I assumed was the bedroom and bathroom. It was exactly as my friend had described, basic but comfortable. The rain hammered against the roof, and the wind made the trees groan outside. I dropped my bag by the door and walked over to the fireplace. There was a small pile of wood stacked beside it, dry and ready to use. I crouched down, arranging the logs and kindling before striking a match. The flame caught, flickering in the dim light, and within minutes, a warm fire was crackling, filling the cabin with heat. I stood up, rubbing my arms, and took a better look around. A small kitchen was tucked into one corner, with an old stove and a few cabinets. A single dim bulb hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly as the wind rattled the cabin. Everything felt still, too still. Maybe it was just the storm outside, but something about the silence inside the cabin felt heavy, like the air was thicker than it should be. I shook off the feeling and went to unpack. The bedroom was just as simple as the rest of the cabin. A bed, a small dresser, a single window with wooden shutters. I pulled them closed, listening to the rain pounding against the glass. The wind whistled through the cracks, and for a moment, I thought I heard something else. A sound mixed in with the wind, something off. I stood still, holding my breath. Nothing, just the storm. I shook my head, telling myself I was being paranoid. It had been a long drive, and I was cold and tired. I changed into dry clothes, leaving my wet ones draped over a chair near the fire. The warmth helped, but the unease hadn't left me. I made a quick dinner, some canned food I had brought with me, eating it at the small table while staring at the flames. The wind was louder now, the rain coming in sheets against the roof. Every now and then, the whole cabin creaked as the storm pushed against it. I kept glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see something staring back at me, but there was nothing, just the dark shapes of trees, swaying in the wind. I tried to push the feeling away. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. The isolation, the storm, the unfamiliar place. It all added up, but deep down something felt wrong. I decided to head to bed early, hoping that sleep would help shake the unease. I left the fire burning, just in case the cabin got too cold during the night. As I lay down, the sound of the storm filled the room, pressing in from all sides. The wind howled, the rain drummed against the roof, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled. I closed my eyes, telling myself I was safe, that the door was locked, that the shutters were closed, that I was alone. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. Something was wrong. The rain was still falling, the wind still howling, but something was different. The air in the room felt heavy, thick, like it was pressing down on me. I lay still, listening, and then I heard it, a sound just beneath the storm, a creak, a slow, deliberate creak, like a footstep on old wood. My breath caught in my throat. The cabin was old, it made noise when the wind pushed against it, but this was different. This was inside. I lay frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Maybe the wind had shifted something. Maybe the fire had made the wood crack. Maybe another creak. Closer this time. I barely breathed. I reached under the bed, fingers wrapping around the handle of my hunting knife. I hadn't expected to need it, but I had brought it just in case. Now I gripped it tight, my palms sweaty despite the cold. The cabin was dark except for the faint glow of the fire, flickering through the open doorway of the bedroom. I stayed still, listening. The wind screamed against the cabin, making the walls tremble. But underneath it, I swore I heard breathing. Slow, steady, not mine. I swallowed hard. My pulse pounded in my ears. I had locked the door. I knew I had. The windows were shut. No one should be inside. But I wasn't alone. For what felt like an eternity, I didn't move. Neither did the sound. The breathing stayed steady, the creak silent. Then, just as slowly as it had come, it faded. Minutes passed. The fire crackled softly in the other room. The wind moaned. I strained my ears, but the sound was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning finally came, gray and wet, I forced myself out of bed. I moved slowly, cautiously, knife still in hand as I checked the cabin. The door was still locked, the windows still shut. Everything was exactly as I had left it, and yet I knew what I had heard. I packed my things in silence, my movements quick and sharp. I didn't care how much it was raining. I wasn't staying another night. As I stepped onto the porch, I froze. There, in the mud, just beneath the window of my room, footprints, leading away from the cabin. And they weren't mine. I never went back. I hadn't been down that road in years. It was one of those back roads you don't use unless you have to. Narrow, winding, full of potholes that could wreck your suspension if you weren't careful. The trees crowded in close, their bare branches scratching at the sky like old bones. I remembered it well from when I was a kid, riding in the passenger seat while my dad drove, pointing out the way to my cousin's cabin. It wasn't really a cabin, more like a rundown house in the middle of nowhere, but we all called it a cabin. It had been in the family for years, passed down from my uncle to my cousin, Daniel. He was the kind of guy who liked his space, preferred the woods over people, and spent most of his time hunting or fishing. I hadn't spoken to him in years, and as far as I knew, he still lived out there, off the grid, doing his thing. I wasn't planning to stop. I was just passing through on my way to a friend's place, taking the old back roads to avoid the highway traffic. It was late, somewhere around 9, and the rain had been falling in that slow, steady way that makes the world feel heavy. The road was slick, the headlights catching the wet pavement and the deep shadows beyond the trees. I wasn't thinking about much, just driving, watching the road, keeping an eye out for deer. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker of movement, something shifting in the trees near the turnoff to my cousin's cabin. A shape, a shadow. It could have been an animal, maybe a deer moving through the brush, but something about it made my stomach clench. It was too tall, too upright. I slowed down without really thinking about it, my hands tightening on the wheel. The road that led to the cabin was just up ahead, a narrow dirt path that cut into the trees. My headlights swung toward it as I passed, and for a split second, I saw something standing there. A man. He was just off the side of the road, half hidden in the trees, standing still. Too still. I only caught a glimpse before I was past him, but in that short moment, I saw enough. Dark clothes, a hood pulled up, face shadowed. Something about the way he stood sent a shiver through me, like he was waiting for something, watching. I kept driving. My heart was pounding, fingers tight around the wheel. Maybe it was just someone passing through, a hunter, or some local out for a late-night walk. But I knew this area. Nobody walked out here, not at night, not in the rain. A few minutes passed, and I told myself to let it go. Just some guy, nothing to do with me. Then my headlights caught something else. Up ahead, on the right side of the road, there was a car, parked just off the shoulder, half hidden by the trees. Old, dark-colored, looked like it hadn't moved in a while. The windows were fogged up from the rain, but I could just make out the silhouette of someone sitting inside. I passed by without slowing down. My gut was telling me something wasn't right. The way the guy had been standing back there, the parked car, the fact that this road barely saw any traffic at all, let alone people just sitting out here in the dark. A few miles later, I reached the turnoff that led back to the highway. I made the turn without hesitation, feeling a small sense of relief as I left the woods behind. The rain was still falling, my wipers dragging back and forth across the windshield. I made it to my friend's place about an hour later. We hung out for a while, had a couple of beers, watched a movie. I didn't mention what I'd seen. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but the whole night, it stayed in the back of my mind. The man standing in the trees, the car parked on the side of the road. The next morning, I woke up early and checked my phone. I had a missed call from an unknown number and a voicemail. I played it, and a deep voice came through the speaker. "Hey, it's Daniel." I froze. I hadn't heard my cousin's voice in years. "I don't know if this number still works, but if you get this, call me back. Something's going on out here." That was it. No details, no explanation, just that. I called him back immediately, but it went to voicemail. I tried again. Nothing. Something was wrong. I got in my truck and headed back the way I came, retracing my route from the night before. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still gray, low clouds hanging heavy over the trees. My stomach felt tight the whole way, like I was bracing for something bad. When I reached the turnoff to Daniel's cabin, I slowed down. The dirt road was muddy from the rain, tire tracks cutting deep into the soft earth. I turned in and followed the road, my truck bouncing over the rough ground. The trees were thick here, pressing in close on both sides. After about half a mile, I saw the cabin up ahead. Something was off. The front door was open, just a few inches, but enough to set off alarms in my head. Daniel wasn't the type to leave his door open, not out here. I parked and got out, my boots sinking into the wet ground. The air was cold, damp with the lingering rain. I hesitated before stepping up to the porch. My pulse was loud in my ears. I pushed the door open. Inside, the cabin was a mess. Chairs knocked over, papers scattered across the floor, a hunting rifle leaning against the wall near the door, unloaded. No sign of Daniel. I stepped inside, my boots creaking against the wooden floor. The air smelled stale, like damp wood and something else, something faint, metallic. Blood. A few small drops, barely noticeable, leading toward the back room. I followed them, my stomach a tight knot. The back room was empty. The bed was unmade, blankets half on the floor. The window was open, rainwater pooling on the windowsill. And then I saw the footprints. Mud, tracked in from outside, leading from the window to the middle of the room, leading back out. Someone had been here, and they had taken Daniel with them. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where my cousin should have been. The air was heavy, silent. I didn't call the police right away. I don't know why. Maybe I was in shock. Maybe I already knew, deep down, that they wouldn't find anything. Because whoever had been watching from the trees last night, whoever had been sitting in that car, they were long gone, and so was Daniel.